Join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
A very good afternoon and welcome to the Briefing PM, your fix of all the latest political news, debate and analysis here on GB News. I'm Darren McCaffrey and here's what's coming up over the next hour. Well, Russia has claimed that it is pulling back troops from the Ukrainian border. However, the West remain pretty sceptical. We'll get the latest from Moscow on Russian-Ukrainian tensions. Could war still be on the cards? Plus, we'll be at NATO HQ in Brussels, where the NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg is going to hold a press conference. We'll bring you that live. In other news, the SNP are facing criticism from their coalition partners over the party's policy on green free ports. We'll get reaction from a Conservative MSP. Plus, we'll be talking about the cost of living crisis as inflation hits another new high. As always, though, get in touch with your views on any of today's subjects, or indeed, if you want to rant and rave about anything else, you can email me at gbviews@gbnews.uk, or you can tweet us at GB News. All that and much more between 3 and 4. But first, at the top of the hour, here's the news with Rosie Wright.
Good afternoon. It's just 1 minute past 3 o'clock. I'm Rosie, here to keep you up to date on GB News. Boris Johnson believes a Russian invasion of Ukraine would shake the foundations of international order. The UK and NATO are sceptical about Russian claims they're withdrawing troops from the Ukrainian border. Well, the UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace warns 60% of Russian land combat power is still stationed there. President Putin insists he's open to diplomatic talks and remains concerned about NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg says Russia has nothing to fear.
NATO is not a threat to Russia, and we remain ready to engage in dialogue and find a diplomatic way forward. But while we continue to work for the best, we must also be prepared for the worst.
The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says Russia will retaliate if Britain imposes new sanctions against Moscow over the crisis in Ukraine. However, the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, says the UK government needs to take an even tougher stance.
I do want to see the government going further in relation to sanctions. I don't think they've used the powers that they've already got as much as they should have done, and I don't think they've looked closely enough at their own donations. And I think any donations to the Conservative Party that have any link to Putin should be looked at very, very carefully. And I want to see further sanctions put in place as quickly as possible.
The Met Police are investigating the Prince of Wales's charity foundation over cash for honours allegations. Now, it's after a close confidant of Prince Charles was reported to police over claims a Saudi donor was offered help to secure a knighthood and British citizenship. Now, the Prince's team has denied he was involved in any way. Prince Andrew is facing renewed calls to give up one of his last remaining major titles, Duke of York, after agreeing to settle out of court the civil sex assault claim brought against him by Virginia Giuffre. The royal's already been stripped of his honorary military roles and the title of His Royal Highness. Prince Andrew says he regrets his association with disgraced financier Jeffrey Epstein and has agreed to make a substantial donation to Miss Giuffre's charity. Legal partner Alan Collins says that's actually a good outcome for both parties.
I think it sends a very clear message, particularly to victims and survivors who have possibly not come forward. But actually, if you do come forward and you do disclose the fact that you've been abused as a child, you will be taken seriously. It doesn't matter where you come from in society, you will be listened to.
Children between the ages of 5 and 11 in Scotland and Wales are going to be offered a COVID vaccination. Ministers in both countries made the decision based on as yet unpublished guidance from the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. Across the UK, house prices increased by more than 10% in the year to December. Now, official figures show the average UK house price rose to £275,000. Freddie Poser from Priced Out told GBNews there aren't enough properties across the country.
Unfortunately, house prices have been continuing to skyrocket for years now, and the government isn't doing nearly enough to sort that out. So it means that more young people are going to be priced out of the market will remain completely inefficient, and it won't work for the average Briton.
Higher prices in clothing and rising costs of some household goods and rents have caused a further rise in the cost of living. Inflation has risen by 5.5% in the 12 months of January to this year. That's a near 30-year high. A crowdfunding page that's been set up for a boy who can't afford to attend a football game has reached over £3,000. That's triple its target. Swindon Town Football Club is trying to find the 6.5-year-old boy called Joe, who says he can't attend matches because his mum has no money for food. Well, Joe wrote the club a letter and sent the star player Harry McCurdy 26p in the post. The Met Office is warning 90-mile-per-hour winds brought by Storm Dudley could pose a danger to life. Amber weather warnings are in place across central and southern Scotland and the north of England. ScotRail has announced some of its services will stop in an hour's time at 4 o'clock for safety. You're now up to date here on GB News. I'll bring you more as it happens. Now let's head back to the briefing with Darren.
Thanks, Rosie. A very good afternoon to you. It's 6 minutes past 3. You're watching the briefing on TV, on radio and on DAB digital radio here on GB News. Big story this week, Russia building up its military forces on Ukraine's border with more troops on the way. That contradicts, of course, Moscow's claim of a drawdown. That's according to NATO's chief Jens Stoltenberg. Despite claims, of course, from the Kremlin that troops were moving away from the Ukrainian border, Western and Ukrainian intelligence remain highly sceptical, with the US President Joe Biden last night stating that a Russian invasion on Ukraine could still happen at any time. Well, let's get more on this. Let's head to Moscow. Jake Cordell is the reporter for the Moscow Times and joins us from the Russian capital. Jake, very good afternoon to you. What is your sense of what is happening? The Prime Minister called it mixed messages yesterday. NATO seems to be suggesting there's no significant movement. Moscow giving the impression that troops are being pulled back.
Yeah, mixed messages is certainly one way of describing it. All throughout this crisis, we've obviously had different positions being put forward by Russia, who has all the way through denied invasion plans. And on the other side, in the Western capitals, in the US in particular, we've heard these intelligence reports about an imminent invasion. But over the last 48 hours, the narratives have diverged to a much greater extent. In Moscow, the mood is almost triumphant. They're mocking the West, saying that, well, we've backed down. Your predictions that we were going to invade today at 3 o'clock in the morning, all this kind of stuff are pointless, that you've been made to look silly. And then on the other side, from Western capitals, we've just heard in the last hour US Secretary of State Antony Blinken say he's seeing no evidence of this drawdown. And it's already been 36 hours since it was announced that Russia was pulling troops back. But Russia hasn't given any details of how many troops are pulling back, where they're pulling back to, whether military equipment is also being pulled back or whether that's being left in place. And there's no trust between the sides. So that's the situation where we are now.
This, in some ways, isn't it, Jake, is right out of Putin's playbook in the sense about sowing either disinformation or confusion.
Yeah, for sure. We've seen Russia take this tack throughout the past decade, really, on a number of issues. And Putin still feels that he hasn't been given by the West what he wants. He wants some legal guarantee that Ukraine will never join NATO. He wants American and Western military equipment and forces pulled out of Eastern Europe, even NATO members in Eastern Europe. And he hasn't got either of them. And the word's been pretty strong that he's not going to get either of them. So from his point of view, sitting in the Kremlin, he maybe thinks, well, why do I need to tell them exactly where I'm pulling my troops back to, exactly how many, exactly when, if they're not giving me the information I want? And he's very happy to sit in this position of confusion, putting some information out there, keeping some things back, because he feels he doesn't have anything to gain from a full climb down publicly.
And Jay, talk us through what happened yesterday in the Russian parliament, this recognition to a degree of the Donbass region that could have significant consequences. Now, it's not been confirmed by Vladimir Putin, but there is a sense that that is what could spark off war if there was to be one.
Yeah, this is certainly one of the areas the West have looked to as part of that mixed signals that we talked about. So Russia's parliament has voted to send a bill to President Vladimir Putin that would effectively recognize Russia recognizes the breakaway Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Now, this would contravene a peace deal that was struck 7 years ago to end the war in eastern Ukraine, which has killed about 14,000 people so far. That was sparked after Russia annexed Crimea. And Putin has said that he's not going to sign that bill just yet. He still sees some life in that peace deal. But what it is now is it's a clear element and tool that Putin can use to put pressure on Ukraine, that they know just with one stroke of the pen, he could recognize these states. And that would perhaps have the whole peace process that was built in 2015 crumble.
What is Vladimir Putin's thinking in all of this, Jake? Many people say, well, it's pretty clear. He wrote an essay, didn't he, last summer, talking about how Ukraine was effectively Russian. In the end, is that what it boils down to? Kind of buffer states and the impression that, you know, Ukraine can't further shift or drift towards the West?
Yeah, I mean, what does Putin want is the $1 billion question. Millions of column inches been written about it, and of course only one person really knows. But there's two key issues here. There's the Ukraine issue and the NATO issue. Yes, the Ukraine issue, like you said, Vladimir Putin feels that Ukraine is almost an inherent part of the Russian identity. That it's almost an extension of the Russian state, and he feels he doesn't like that Ukraine is moving more towards the West and pointing more towards the West. He feels that he's almost lost Ukraine, and of course these two countries were part of the same country in the Soviet Union. And then the NATO issue is another one. Putin feels he was given, or Russia was given, guarantees at the end of the Cold War that NATO would not expand into Eastern Europe, former communist countries. Of course it did that. So Putin feels he was betrayed then. He doesn't feel he can trust the West. And that's why he's now taking the opportunity to put these issues together, push back on Ukraine, and also try and push American and Western forces out of some of the other Baltic countries closer to Russia.
And just very finally, Jake, if an invasion was to happen, and we reiterate that word, if, this is a risky strategy, isn't it, for Vladimir Putin? We know, actually, that when Russian troops have died in combat in the past, their mothers, their families have gathered outside the Kremlin to protest. Ukraine will not be easy for the Russians to invade, or indeed, if they even thought about trying to hold that territory. That will be part of the calculation, just how politically risky domestically this is for the Russian president.
Yes, definitely. And this comes after 8-9 years of economic stagnation here in Russia, following the annexation of Crimea, when sanctions were placed on the Russian economy. Russian people aren't as rich as they were 8 years ago. Living standards have fallen. And as you say, especially when they hear news of Russian soldiers falling in wars that they don't particularly understand, if we think about Syria and places like that. And while Ukraine does have a strong connection with the Russian people, obviously much more than the Middle East does, they are still kind of opinion polls aren't clear on whether Russians, are that committed to this process, whether they would be willing to stomach that. And that could be a source of domestic opposition. Of course, whether that affects Putin, we don't know. He's wiped out the domestic opposition here over the past few years. So he may feel comfortable enough that he doesn't need to take care of public opinion right now.
Reports that Alexei Navalny, of course, one of those opposition leaders, may well face up to 10 years in prison. Jake, thank you very much indeed. Jake Cordell there from the Moscow Times, joining us from the Russian capital. In the next couple of minutes, we're going to bring you that live press conference we're expecting from Jens Stoltenberg at NATO headquarters in Belgium, in Brussels. Defence ministers will be meeting there today. As we've been reporting, of course, NATO have repeatedly suggested that they have not seen this drawdown happen. Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, reiterating that in the last hour or so, suggesting that there is very little evidence that the Russians are withdrawing the troops from the border. In the studio, talks into that press conference is Tom Harwood, our political correspondent. Tom, afternoon to you. Defence ministers, as I say, meeting in Belgium today. Any sense of what's been going on?
Well, we've got this broad idea that the West wants to present a united front, something that has broadly been happening over the last few days, if not the last few months. There's certainly, on the surface at least, an agreement between these NATO powers of a heavy package of sanctions if Russia were to incur further into Ukraine, although behind the scenes there's been a great deal of disagreement in terms of what the trigger of such a package would be. It's interesting to see that the Americans are really leading the pack when it comes to verification of whether or not this announced withdrawal is actually taking place. The key things that are being watched out for are less so the troop movements and more so all of these field hospitals that have been constructed in short order in recent weeks. And if these field hospitals remain relatively temporary structures, many people will raise an eyebrow. It's very easy to rush troops back in, or indeed, it is very easy to incur upon a country with fewer than 150,000 troops. With, say, 100,000, it's still very possible to incur upon Ukrainian sovereign territory further. So there are big question marks that the West and that NATO needs answering before they're going to take what the Kremlin published earlier this week at face value.
Yeah, indeed. And Ben Wallace, of course, the Defence Secretary, is in Belgium today. We know that EU leaders, I think, are going to meet tomorrow in Brussels, where this will be a key topic. I'm sure some of them, as I've always suggested, will bring up the issue of the European army again, so less reliance necessarily on NATO. Ben Wallace, though, interestingly, making clear Britain's the third largest defence spender in the world. I think it overtook India last year. Russia is fifth. Clearly, the UK is a big player in all of this. But there has been a sense, I think, of frustration, hasn't there, on the British side with kind of Emmanuel Macron, but more importantly with Germany.
Oh, certainly. And it is important here to stress the difference between sort of the transatlantic alliance in the frame of the United Kingdom and of the United States versus the continental alliance in the frame of France and in particular Germany, countries that are much more reliant on gas imports from Russia. Indeed, it must be said that since 2014, since Russia annexed Crimea, the amount of gas that was imported into Central and Western European countries from Russia has actually grown pretty steadily. Precisely the wrong signal that you'll want to send to a demagogue or a dictator in terms of they do something that the international community roundly condemns, and then you continue to buy gas in huge volumes from that company, indeed expanding those volumes. So potentially a very bad signal that has been sent over the last 8-9 years. What's interesting here is that Germany's energy security has actually potentially had a big part to play here. Of course, Germany closing its nuclear power stations, looking for other forms to heat its homes, and that means a reliance on Russia. Of course, no country in Europe has changed their attitude towards that Nord Stream 2 pipeline, something that the US and the UK vociferously opposes. Indeed, some of those Baltic states very vociferously oppose as well, yet Germany still apparently in favour of it, even in light of what's happening on the borders of Ukraine.
And just very finally, Tom, the Prime Minister was in Kiev last week, of course. He's been to Poland, been to Brussels as well. I think an expectation he's going to go on his travels again later on this week.
There is. We're expecting a trip into Eastern Europe. Of course, the Prime Minister has found a sort of new lease of life as a statesman on the world stage, not only playing a vital role in the response to this crisis. Of course, the only designated aircraft carrier for NATO is one of our two British aircraft carriers. Indeed, we have battle groups, we have troops stationed in training capacities all the way across Eastern Europe, and even down as far as Cyprus, where we have military personnel as well. Really, we are a significant player when it comes here, and of course our Prime Minister is involved.
But he's not going to Moscow.
No.
We've seen Olaf Scholz there and Emmanuel Macron. Why is that? Is it because relations are a lot frostier.
It's hard to read this. Of course, there have been several scheduled attempts to call calls between Putin and Johnson. Indeed, calls have taken place. And of course, the Foreign Secretary and the Defence Secretary have both visited Moscow in recent days as well. Perhaps the idea is that Boris doesn't necessarily think it's a good look to be seen to be cozying up to Putin. There was that sort of awkward photo op that we saw between Emmanuel Macron and President Putin recently, sitting at the ends of that very, very long table. And indeed, when there have been events on the podium, whether it was Foreign Secretary Liz Truss being admonished by the Russians, as you'd expect. I mean, Boris has taken a pretty strong stance against the Russians, so potentially he doesn't want to fall into any rhetorical traps that they may be laying down. I think it is interesting to see the frosty relationship feeding into the less fulsome relationship there. Both sides, it may be to their advantage to not have that big show of the shaking hands between Vladimir Putin and Boris Johnson.
Cool. Tom, for the time being, thank you very much indeed. As I say, we're hoping to go to Brussels, Belgium, to NATO headquarters. We are expecting a press conference from Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary-General, in the next couple of minutes. We'll bring you that live. We're going to take a quick break here on GB News. Also coming up, the cost of living crisis, and we'll be in Scotland. Plus, we'll bring you up to date with the latest news at this half hour. That and much more in just a couple of minutes. Stay tuned.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before. It's basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood, and every weekday we bring you The Briefing live from 9:30 a.m. The stories, analysis, and live debate that you need to hear.
Quite right, Tom, of course.
Was this something that had been considered at all?
Difficult to answer.
Gas-guzzling helicopters circling. Noise is being made here. Joe Biden walking out. Thank you very much for joining us. Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, Monday to Friday, 9:30 a.m. on GB News.
Join me, Gloria De Piero, Monday to Thursday at noon for The Briefing. We go to the parts of Parliament that you won't see elsewhere. Plus, there's exclusive interviews with MPs from all parties.
But quite often, they paper over the real truth. Why does a working class lad like you join the Tories?
That's a good question.
Don't miss it, Monday to Thursdays at noon on GB News.
Very welcome back to the briefing here on GB News, 23 minutes past 3 on this Wednesday afternoon. Thank you indeed for your company. We're just waiting on that press conference from the NATO Secretary General to start in Belgium. We'll bring you that, of course, live as it happens. But let's focus on NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, as it stands. And let's speak to a fellow at Chatham House and a former public affairs officer at NATO. That is Samantha de Bourdain, who joins us down the line. Samantha, very good afternoon to you. NATO's been around for 70, 80 years now. Just give us a sense of what the organisation is about, because it continuously claims, doesn't it, that it's a defence organisation there to protect its member states, but many, including the Russians, don't see it like that.
Well, no, the Russians don't see it like that, because one of the fundamental principles of NATO is that an attack on one is an attack on all. And so Russia right now is complaining about the potential expansion of NATO eastwards and towards Ukraine. And what that would mean was that if Ukraine were actually a member of NATO, an attack on Ukraine would elicit a response from all 30 member states of NATO. So in a way, by threatening Ukraine the way it has, NATO is encouraging, Ukraine is encouraging its own people to start thinking about NATO membership. So before 2014, people in Ukraine were pretty indifferent towards the idea of NATO. I've met a lot of people in Ukraine who before 2014, which was the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of the war in the Donbass, before people did not even think that Ukraine would ever join NATO realistically, even though the alliance had opened its doors to Ukraine in 2008. After the beginning of Russian aggression in Ukraine, ordinary people began to think, well, maybe we do need extra protection. We can't look after ourselves. And that is when an overwhelming desire to at least consider much larger integration into NATO began.
But in many ways, though, Samantha, as much as there might be an aspiration for Ukraine to join NATO, I mean, it's not really going to happen, isn't it, given the fact that it's kind of de facto at war with Russia already in the Donbass region, and you've got the annexation of Crimea. I mean, even though obviously the West suggests that they will not rule out Ukrainian membership, it's not going to happen anytime soon.
You're absolutely right, and Putin knows that as well. One of the principles that were laid out in the study on NATO enlargement was that if a country has a territorial dispute, it is very unlikely that the alliance will open its doors. It doesn't mean impossible, but it makes it unlikely. And Putin knows this. So all these statements that the Russians have been making for the past few years, and much more frequently since December last year, that they want guarantees that Ukraine will not join NATO, well, they have actually created those guarantees themselves, which is why I've said on many occasions that these negotiations started in bad faith. They started on premises that have already been made impossible because of Russia's actions. And that is why, however much as someone who worked in an international organization, who works at NATO, who worked at the European Commission in the past, someone who's now studying Russia and who wants to see a peaceful diplomatic resolution, and that is what we must all hope for. The way the Russians have been negotiating from the very beginning of this process has not given much grounds for hope that they are negotiating in good faith. The way they presented these so-called treaties to the West in December, in a way that goes against all international rules of how you negotiate a treaty, the way the Foreign Minister Lavrov has treated his interlocutors, the way he treated Antony Blinken in Geneva, the way he treated Liz Truss in Geneva, in Moscow, by deliberately humiliating her publicly, is not the way a statesman behaves. And this, again, does not make me feel very optimistic for the way the talks are going, in spite of indications that are constantly being contradicted by all sorts of people that troops may or may not be withdrawing, that there are some worrying signs. And one thing we have to remember, warfare today is not just about tanks crossing borders. It's also about what we call hybrid warfare, cyber warfare. Ukraine has been under cyber attack for the last 24 hours. Yesterday, the Defense Ministry, a number of banks were more or less offline for a lot of the day. Last week, there were cyber attacks on various Ukrainian government bodies with very aggressive signs coming on people's screens saying, you have to be careful, things are only going to get worse for you. The Russian government has not been officially implicated, but all signs are pointing towards Russia.
Okay, Samantha, appreciate your analysis. Samantha de Bourdagne joining us there talking about Ukraine. We are still waiting for that press conference. Do get in touch, though, gbviews@gbnews.uk if you've got any emails or thoughts that you do want to send to us, or indeed you can tweet us at GB News. Let's move on, though, as we're waiting for that press conference, to the cost of living crisis. We've seen inflation, hit 5.1% today. House prices also up £27,000 on average compared to this time last year. And, of course, we've got those tax rises coming in April. Tom Harwood, our political correspondent, is still with us. Tom, when we look at the real impact that this is having now on people's lives, it is really quite stark, isn't it?
It is. It's something that's not known to this generation of political leaders, really. We haven't seen inflation at this level since, for 30 years. But crucially as well, this house price crisis is something that I think has the potential to play very, very poorly for this government. We've seen that the age at which you start voting Conservative has been steadily rising. And that's a pretty unsustainable thing if the sort of people in their mid-40s that David Cameron was pretty good at winning over stop voting for the Conservative Party, maybe because housing has become quite so expensive. If particularly people living in cities stop voting for the Conservative Party, things start to get pretty difficult for them. They could win over a lot of the post-industrial North and Midlands, but still not be able to get enough seats to get over the line. If they lose plenty of places in and around London, potentially in the southeast, potentially around Cambridgeshire, Oxfordshire, these sort of places where you've got this weird sort of tension. People who are currently living there who want to vote Conservative don't want house building, but people who might want to move there won't vote Conservative unless there have houses to own. Right, exactly. So it's this issue whereby in the short term there are political interests to not build houses, but in the long term there are political imperatives to build houses. And the fact that £27,000 was the amount that the average house grew by in terms of expense this year, that's more than the average person earned. The average house at the moment is earning more than the average human being, which is a pretty extraordinary place to be in.
Indeed, and some might suggest unsustainable. And this is all having an impact, at least in part, on the Chancellor's ratings, how the public view him.
That's right. A poll from Savanta Comres out today shows that the Chancellor's approval ratings are down to just +3%. So on net, the Chancellor is still positive, but just by +3. For context, back in March, May last year, it was +30%. So that's a real cratering of the Chancellor's approval ratings. No longer the most popular politician in the land. No doubt it's easy to be popular when you're handing out free money. But then when you're reaping the consequences of all of that spending, whether it's higher inflation or indeed the tax rises that are coming as well, then things get tricky. And potentially we've seen the shine come off the Chancellor who was once so popular.
OK. Thank you very much indeed, Tom, for joining us. Tom Harwood, our political correspondent. Hugh David saying on NATO, this has got nothing to do with NATO. Putin is simply after a land grab, and he knows apart from some blustering and finger-pointing, the West will do nothing. That's why he won't accept NATO on its border. gbviews@gbnews.uk. Do get in touch and we'll get to some of your views a little later on the programme. Coming up in the next 30 minutes, though, hopefully we'll get that press conference from Brussels. Otherwise, we'll be talking about the cost of living crisis. What can the government do? Should it be doing more? And we'll be in Scotland. But before all that, it's over to Rosie with the latest news at just after 3:30.
Good afternoon, it is 3:33. I'm Rosie Wright, here to keep you up to date on GB News. Russia's envoy to the EU says he doesn't expect any escalation in the Ukrainian crisis in the coming weeks. Now, that follows claims by Russia that they're withdrawing troops from the border. At NATO's defence ministers' meeting in Brussels, the Secretary-General, Jens Stoltenberg, said that while there was no evidence of this, President Putin's desire for continued dialogue supports the case for cautious optimism. Prince Andrew is facing renewed calls to give up one of his last remaining major titles, Duke of York, after agreeing to settle a civil sex assault claim brought against him by Virginia Giuffre. The royal's already been stripped of his honorary military roles and the title of His Royal Highness. Prince Andrew says he regrets his association with the disgraced financier Jeffrey Epstein and has agreed to make a substantial donation to Miss Giuffre's charity. The Prince of Wales's charity foundation is being investigated by the Met Police over allegations of cash for honours. In a statement, they said it relates to media reports claiming offers of help were made to secure honours and citizenship for a Saudi national. Prince Charles's team have stated publicly he was not aware of any links between donations to the foundation and any honours. The cost of living has increased further, with inflation rising by 5.5% in the 12 months to January of this year. That reaches a near 30-year high. While higher prices in clothing, rising costs of some household goods and increases in rent were key factors behind the increase. Children between the ages of 5 and 11 in Scotland are going to be offered a COVID vaccination. Well, that follows a policy change in Wales, who made the same announcement yesterday. Ministers in both countries say they've seen guidance from the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, who suggested the change. A swimmer in Sydney has been killed by a shark. It's the first fatal shark attack in the city since 1963. Witnesses say it was a 15-foot great white. You're now up to date here on GB News. We're on your TV, online and DAB Plus radio. Shortly, we'll be back to the briefing with Darren.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate
from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is
Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Very welcome back to the briefing here on GB News. 23 minutes to 4 o'clock. Don't forget, if you like what we do here on GB News, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just go on YouTube, click the subscribe button, and you'll get more of some of the best bits of GB News. And you can watch us, of course, live online as well. Now, let's return to the big domestic story today, and that is, of course, the cost of living crisis, because UK wage growth continued to lag, didn't it? And not just that announcement, we got that big announcement about house prices that we're just talking about before the break. 27,000 the average house price has increased by, as Tom said, more than the average wage in this country. It does seem to be getting harder and harder to get on the housing ladder. Price houses have doubled in the last decade, with first-time buyers in St Albans reportedly needing more than 5 times their annual salary to get a house these days. Well, our reporter Amelia Harper has been speaking to people about the difficulty in trying to buy a home.
Very difficult for anybody, under the age of 30 to even consider getting on the housing market at this point. Even after years of saving up money, still not in a position, especially around this area, to be able to buy a property.
They seem a lot higher compared to wages than they've ever been, and it seems like every time they bring out a new scheme to try to help people get on the housing ladder, it doesn't work because it just artificially props up the price of houses, and the way to do it to help them would be to build more houses.
They're too high. I think for the young, sort of early to mid 20s, even there's just unless you're in a fortunate enough position to get the backing, you're just not really going to get to the stage until much later down the line to actually get on the property ladder.
We held out to sell. We then sold in a panic. We should have held on to the flat and waited to get a higher price for it, because now we've sold it and prices have gone up here so significantly that we're in a position where we're still renting, waiting for a property crash.
House prices are only driven by the availability of money and by demand. So if people can borrow the money, which they can, increase multiples of income, then that's what drives prices. And what I don't understand is government policy which stimulates demand for a product which is in short supply. So Help to Buy and everything else is stimulating demand, when really the answer is to increase the supply.
There got the people of St Albans speaking to GB News a little earlier. I speak now to Matthew Lesh. He is, of course, the head of policy at the Institute of Economic Affairs. And just on the line, Matthew, very good afternoon to you. Listening to one of the residents there at St Albans suggesting that they're waiting for a property crash. We seem a long way from that, but is this growth sustainable?
Look, I mean, the growth is sustainable for as long as we're failing to build enough homes whilst effectively expanding the money supply. So we've got increased levels of demand. People have got a lot of savings as a result of COVID. And at the same time, we're not ensuring enough houses to meet demand, particularly in areas where people most want to live. So I think housing prices will keep going up. I can't foresee a crash. Of course, I could look very silly soon. There might be some slight reduction in house prices as a result of interest rates going up, which I think they are going to have to go up because of these levels of inflation. That won't make housing any more affordable. That'll just increase people's mortgages, so it'll not really make it any easier to buy a house overall.
And is this simply about building more homes, Matthew? And that is the case. I mean, what is the hold-up? I mean, it can't just be NIMBYism up and down the country, is it?
I mean, Darren, I hate to be somebody from a think tank oversimplifying an issue, but really the issue is we haven't built enough homes in places where people want to live. Now, the economic issue is quite simple here. The politics is what's difficult, of course, is people have no incentive. If you live in an area with a lot of demand, you already own a home, which the majority of people in this country already do own a home, there's no incentive on you for there to want to be more homes in your area. In fact, you might feel like you're going to lose something out because you build more homes. The challenge with the government is finding a politically popular way to build more homes. So one of the really good ideas to do that is this idea of street votes, which has been supported by various think tanks from Policy Exchange, the IEA, to Create Streets, and even Michael Gove said he support that you let people in the street all vote together to increase the density and put in place some kind of design standard. And that means you can have broad agreement, everyone benefits from housing growth. I also think local councils should be able to keep more of the benefits in order to fund services from granting housing permission. And it's about finding smart reforms to ensure that people do benefit, the quality of their services improves, the infrastructure doesn't get worse as you're building more homes. And that's the policy challenge when it comes to house building.
Let's move on to wages, because, of course, we saw inflation figures out today. We know wages on the whole aren't keeping up. And this all, as employers are starting to suggest that they are going to pay their employees more. But there is a real danger, as the Governor of the Bank of England was suggesting, that having slightly imported inflation, if you like, that we might start generating our own inflation with everyone getting a pay rise, which then just pushes things up further.
Look, I have a lot of respect for Andrew Bailey, but I don't think I really agree with his analysis here. The reason why we have inflation is not because it's imported, it's because the Bank of England has been printing cash like there's no tomorrow for the last almost 2 years as a result of COVID. They've been funding government borrowing on the market, massively increase the supply of money. When you have more money following too few goods, you're going to get inflation. And I think workers are entitled to ask for a pay rise, to negotiate a pay rise. I'm not going to tell anyone not to ask for a pay rise because the Bank of England has overinflated the economy with loose monetary policy. We should remember the Bank of England has a legal mandate for a 2% rate of inflation, but they failed to reach that mandate. They need to tell us why, and they need to tell us how they're going to fix the problem. They've currently got highest inflation in 30 years at 5.5%. We're not seeing wages increase by anywhere near as much. So you're seeing a real terms decline in quality of life. Now, if you said this a year ago and you had this kind of discussion, you would have thought I was a madman because I was talking about the risk of inflation. But in fact, the IEA has actually been talking about inflation since mid-2020, just because the simple economic reality, the facts on the ground are that if you increase money supply, you have inflation. So what can we do about it? Well, in order to fix it, you need to undo the problem. That's going to be painful.
Matthew,
there's no simple way to do it, unfortunately.
Sorry, Matthew, I'm not an economist, but my understanding is that this is not something that's confined to Britain. In fact, inflation is hitting record highs across most of the Western world. I'm not entirely sure what the Bank of England in the short term can do about that. My point is that if everyone increases wages, those costs get passed on, don't they? And that means then we then get into a trap of just inflation after inflation after inflation. We start chasing our tails.
Yeah, I mean, there's been inflation elsewhere as well for similar reasons, because we've had loose monetary policy in the Eurozone and the US. This is a global problem with similar causes everywhere. In terms of the wage, the risk of a wage spiral inflation, you're absolutely right. There is a risk if people keep on demanding higher pay rises, then they have to shut costs, you get an inflationary spiral. The only way to fix that is not by asking workers to stop requesting pay rises, actually to put up interest rates. You need to pull the rug out. You need to deal with the underlying issue, which is too much money in the economy chasing too few goods. And as I was getting at, saying that's going to be painful. Putting up mortgage rates is not something. I don't envy the Monetary Policy Committee to have to make this very difficult decision, because putting up the interest rates will slow down the economy, will hurt people's employment prospects. But the alternative is a lower quality of life. If we don't, now the genie's out of the bottle with inflation, we have to make tough decisions like we've made historically in order to put it back in, and that does mean higher interest rates to bring down inflation.
Okay, Matthew, always appreciate your thoughts and your time. Matthew Less there from
Thanks for having me.
Institute of Economic Affairs joining us down the line. Do get in touch about that, or indeed anything else we're talking today at GBViews at gbnews.uk. Let's move, though, to Scotland, because the Scottish Greens will have nothing to do with the establishment of 2 new free ports north of the border. It comes after a deal was agreed between the UK and Scottish governments for green free ports. Well, the Greens' finance spokesperson described the move as greenwashing, as he said that there is nothing genuinely green about the hubs. It marks a significant division between the SNP and their coalition partners, the Greens in government. Well, coalition, we say coalition, cooperation agreement, I think they call it, of course, which was reached last August. Well, joining us now is the Scottish Conservative MSP, Liam Kerr, who joins us down the line. Liam, what do you make of this claim from the Greens that this is greenwashing and there's nothing genuinely green about these new free ports that are due to be established in Scotland?
It's utterly ridiculous. I mean, what the green free ports are all about is creating jobs. It is about investment opportunities. It is about bringing business into Scotland and the UK and regenerating communities. What's actually going on here, and I'm afraid people in Scotland have become all too used to this, is typical student politics from the Green Party. I mean, I guess at least they're in some way consistent. They're anti-business, anti-growth, anti-economy message they've been pushing for many years now. It is, of course, utterly misguided, but most frightening for the people of Scotland is that utterly misguided and, dare I say, naive and ignorant view now forms part of our government in Scotland.
What is, to the average Joe Bloggs out there, what is a free port and why is it a good idea? We know they've been established in England because many people simply won't actually know what they are.
Okay, so in brief, we are getting 2 free ports in Scotland following the UK government and the Scottish government working together, which is, I have to say, very refreshing. The Scottish government finally decided to put aside its grievances and start working with the UK government to leverage £52 million worth of seed funding into creating 2 free ports in Scotland. What are they? They're basically ports with up to a 45-kilometre radius round them, which benefit from certain tax relief, certain benefits, certain customs changes, certain business rates retention, and certain support. And as part of creating them, as I said earlier, bidders need to be putting a case together which is talking about community regeneration, talking about creating high-quality jobs, not just jobs, but high-quality jobs on good salaries and fair conditions. And I think above all, the key point here is that the existing free ports that have been established in England, they're talking about adding £23.9 billion worth of GVA, but with £25.3 billion worth of private investment. So I think your viewers will see this is hugely significant and it's hugely important for Scotland and the UK economy.
Now, you talked about collaboration there between the UK government and the Scottish government being refreshing. In fact, there might be more cordial relations than there are within the Scottish Conservative Party and the wider Conservative Party. Interestingly, when Boris Johnson was in Scotland earlier on this week, Douglas Ross was not there. Is there a sense that if Boris Johnson remains as Prime Minister, what are you going to do? How are you going to mend relations? Are you going to campaign for him in the next election? How does that all work?
Well, absolutely. We are the Conservative Party. I mean, we are the Scottish Conservatives, of course. I don't speak for Douglas Ross and what his diary is. We're on recess at the moment as it goes. But I was very pleased to see Boris in Scotland and some of the announcements that he's talking about with levelling up. In particular, and something I've appeared on GB News previously talking about, was Boris gave full support, robust support for our oil and gas industry. Now, I am a North East MSP. I am hugely concerned about some of the really misguided announcements that have been coming out from the Scottish Government around our North Sea oil and gas. Effectively, the current Scottish Government would happily throw 100,000 jobs in our North Sea oil and gas industry over a cliff. So I was delighted yesterday when Boris Johnson was up here saying, look, we absolutely back North Sea oil and gas. We understand that there will be a demand there until 2050. And we either, going back to your earlier reports about cost of living and energy, the energy crisis, we either source that energy close to home with its attendant positive impact on prices, or we expose ourselves ever more to Russian oil and gas, to imported LNG from Qatar with double the carbon footprint. So when Boris Johnson's up here in Scotland talking positively about the North Sea, talking positively about our energy demands, I welcome that very heartily.
Liam Kerr, appreciate your time. Scottish MSP there, Liam Kerr, joining us from, I think it was Aberdeen, in the top left-hand corner. Lots of getting in touch. Anne says, when the countries in NATO agree to pay 2% into the coffers but fail to do so, having a go there, of course, at Germany, saying it's the richest EU member, but less affluent countries like Greece do pull their full contribution. It appears stronger action needs to be taken to force every country to pay their full amount. That's from Anne Bell. Denise, on the cost of living crisis and the rise in house prices, says that we need fewer people, not more homes. Let's go for some final thoughts from Tom Harwood, who's in the studio. Tom, you fundamentally disagree with that argument about fewer people and not necessarily more homes. But, you know, the rise in house price kind of argument, as you summed up, is something that the Conservative Party, frankly, have failed to get to grips with, even though you might, and others would argue it's entirely expedient for them to do so.
Yeah.
Over the last 10, 15 years, really since they've been in government, we seem to be perpetually in a housing shortage crisis.
Well, this has really started since the late 1990s. That's when the prices of houses really decoupled from the growth in wages. And if we look at any sort of analysis of the data, you can see from sort of the late 90s, early 2000s, that decoupling really started to go like gangbusters. And it's tricky because there are two different incentives, as we were discussing earlier, for the Conservative Party. Some seats in the short term want to avoid any house building at all. Any suggestion that green fields might be being built on, even though only around 2% of green land in the UK is built on as things stand. But the long-term imperative is that there are people owning homes. People who own their own homes are more likely to vote Conservative. People who are renting are more likely to vote for the Labour Party. Frankly, if not enough people can afford to buy their own homes and are forced into the rental market, that is bad for the Tories. The tricky situation is, how do you bridge that gap? How do you provide homes in the long term without upsetting some of those homeowners in the short term?
And just very finally, on the cost of living, we call it a crisis. Inflation up, house prices up, energy prices up, and taxes soon to go up. Is there any sense in government, because we know there's a lot of Conservative backbenchers who do not agree, particularly with this national insurance rise, that the government is going to move on this at all?
If there was a time that the government was going to move on the national insurance tax hike, it would have been about 3 weeks ago. There was a lot of discussion about whether or not Boris Johnson would reverse course on that. He was a bit ambivalent in a couple of interviews as to whether or not he was considering delaying, at the very least, that tax rise for a year. Of course, it's part of national insurance this year, and then next year it becomes the health and social care levy, a different line on your tax return. Well, then he made that joint statement with the Chancellor that this was indeed going ahead, potentially because a one-year delay in it would mean that suddenly the tax rise came closer to an election.
Okay, Tom, we're just going to pause there because it's finally happened. Let's go to the press conference in Brussels with the NATO Secretary-General, Jens Stoltenberg.
Security crisis in Europe in decades. Allies welcome all diplomatic efforts, and there are signs from Moscow that diplomacy could continue. But so far, we do not see any sign of de-escalation on the ground. No withdrawals of troops or equipment. This may, of course, change. However, what we see today is that Russia maintains a massive invasion force ready to attack, with high-end capabilities from Crimea to Belarus. This is the biggest concentration of forces in Europe since the Cold War. From the start, NATO allies have made clear that further Russian aggression against Ukraine would have a high cost. And we have called out Russia's actions, plans and disinformation. At the same time, NATO remains prepared for dialogue. It is not too late for Russia to step back from the brink of conflict and choose the path of peace. NATO has sent concrete written proposals to Russia on transparency, risk reduction and arms control. We have yet to receive a response. I reiterate my invitation to Russia to meet again in the NATO-Russia Council. NATO will not compromise on core principles: the right of each nation to choose its own path and our ability to protect and defend all allies. We have already enhanced our deterrence and defence with more troops, planes and ships, and high readiness of the NATO response force. These steps are defensive. NATO is not a threat to Russia. We do not know what will happen in Ukraine, but the situation has already demonstrated we face a crisis in European security. Moscow has made it clear that it is prepared to contest the fundamental principles that have underpinned our security for decades, and to do so by using force. I regret to say that this is the new normal in Europe. Therefore, today, ministers decided to develop options for further strengthen NATO's deterrence and defence, including to consider establishing new NATO battle groups in Central and Eastern and Southeastern Europe. And they welcomed the offer by France to lead such a battle group in Romania. Our military commanders will now work on the details and report back within weeks. Earlier today, we also held a regular meeting of the Nuclear Planning Group. Ministers considered worrying developments across the globe, including Russia's and China's modernization of their nuclear arsenals and the continued risk of nuclear proliferation. Allies consulted on how to keep our nuclear deterrence safe, secure and effective, so NATO's deterrence and defence remains strong. Ministers also welcomed the progress made on burden sharing, with the 7th consecutive year of increased defence spending by European allies and Canada. This means $270 billion in additional spending on defence since 2014. And we welcome that the large majority of allies are now allocating at least 20% of the defence investment to major equipment, research and development. This evening, we will discuss NATO's next strategic concept. I'm confident that when leaders meet in Madrid in June, they will reaffirm that Europe and North America must continue to stand strong together in NATO. Because NATO is the unique, essential and indispensable transatlantic forum for our defence and security. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
We'll start with BBC here.
Thank you very much, Secretary General. Jonathan Beale, BBC. You talked about new battle groups. Are those going to happen regardless of what Russia does? And can you give us a time frame of when we might see forces sent to Romania, Bulgaria, elsewhere? And then also, I think you just said, I regret to say, this is the new norm. What is the new norm for European security? You say it's in crisis. You're essentially saying it's going to be in crisis for a long time.
Well, the new normal is that Russia has demonstrated that it really is willing to contest some of the fundamental principles for our security. The right for every nation to choose its own path, and also, of course, the right for NATO allies to defend and protect each other. They actually suggested a legally binding treaty violating those principles. And they have used force, the biggest concentration of combat force since the end of the Cold War, to underpin and to try to intimidate other countries in Europe to in a way respect or to accept the Russian demands. So this is a new normal, which is violating core principles, which has been important for the security and the stability of Europe for decades. And therefore I regret to say that we don't know what will happen, but we know what has already happened. And that is that Russia has demonstrated a will to use force to try to coerce other countries and to try to change some fundamental principles that are important for our shared security. And that's the reason why we need to also consider more longer-term adjustments of NATO's posture in the East. I will not preempt any final decision. We have asked our military commanders to provide advice and provide more details on the scale and the scope, including of potential new battle groups in the East, in the Southeast, in Romania and the Black Sea region, and also other potential adjustments of our more longer-term presence in the East. But I think it's important to understand that what we now have launched, the work on a more longer-term adjustment to our posture in the East, our presence in the East, that is just one element of what we have done over the last year and months. After 2014, we implemented the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense by establishing the battle groups in the Baltic countries, by modernizing the NATO command structure, by tripling the size of the NATO response force, and also by starting to invest more in defense. This has already happened over the last year since 2014. Then over the last weeks and months, we have, first of all, deployed more NATO troops in the eastern part of the alliance. More troops, more ships, more planes under existing authorities and structures under SACEUR. And that is to make sure that we are able to monitor, to follow what Russia is doing, and to also reassure allies in the eastern part of the alliance. That has already happened. Then we have also increased the readiness of the NATO response force, so we can quickly reinforce with even more troops and forces in the eastern part of the alliance. So it is not as if we are waiting for something to happen. We have already done a lot, but then we will consider a more longer-term adjustment, and we will have the advice from the military commanders within weeks, and then we will make decisions after that.
Reuters.
Thank you very much. Just a clarification. I know that the tasking is only just beginning, but these battle groups, are they likely to be similar to what we've seen set up in the Baltics and Poland? And as a second point, if I may, is this not the sort of thing that would antagonize Moscow and therefore should be avoided at this critical time? Thank you.
NATO is a defensive alliance. NATO is not a threat to Russia, and we have been clear for years and months that we are ready to sit down and also listen to Russian security concerns and to address issues like, for instance, arms control. If they are concerned about missiles and offensive weapons, the best way to deal with that is to sit down and engage in good faith in talks about how can we reduce the number of missiles. But that has to be balanced and verifiable. We have been able to do that before. It is possible to make agreements with Russia, not least on arms control. We have seen that with the INF Treaty back in the 80s, that actually banned all intermediate range weapons. That was extremely important for European security. Then a few years ago we saw the demise of that treaty, but that was because Russia deployed intermediate range missiles in violation of the INF Treaty. But of course we can go back to a regime where we ban categories of weapons if this is balanced and verifiable. We have proven before that we can limit the number of long-range missiles, and there are strategic talks going on between the United States and Russia. So we are not a threat. We are ready for dialogue, and we have put forward a long list of specific topics where we believe it's possible to find common ground and to address some of those concerns that Russia has raised. And we have no plans in a way to deploy offensive systems in Ukraine. This is what we're...
There you go. That is the NATO Secretary-General, Jens Stoltenberg, for the third time today, addressing the cameras on the subject of events in Ukraine. Coming up in the next 57.5 minutes for you, finally, a plan to deal with migrants crossing the Channel. We'll tell you which 3 islands are in the running to host asylum seekers who would be deported within 48 hours of being picked up. So the plan goes. Also, why is an airline, an organisation we entrust the safety of